My name is Claire Morgan. I'm 30 years old, and the greatest betrayal of my life came from the closest person to me. People usually expect betrayal from strangers. But in my story, the guilty one was my most trusted confidant, my childhood friend, my almost sister Natalie Reed. I met her when I was 13. We studied together in high school, went to college in the same city. In our graduation photo, we stood side by side, smiling. Our families treated us as inseparable. Whenever I was in trouble, she was the first person I called. But one day, a letter in my mailbox shattered all that trust. A notice from the bank showed a large debt under my name, a credit card account I had never opened. At first, I thought it was a mistake. But then a second, a third letter arrived. Each had my social security number and my address. At first, I thought it was a mistake. But then a second, a third letter arrived. Each had my social security number, my address. A chilling truth hit me. My identity had been stolen. And worse, the pieces pointed straight at Natalie. Day 1, I panicked. Day 2, I planned. I placed a fraud alert with Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion and froze my credit. I filed an identity theft report with the FTC, obtained a police incident number, and called each bank. IP logs, delivery addresses, answers to security questions. They should have pointed squarely to me, yet there were tiny slips. For my mother's maiden name, the answer matched Natalie's favorite author's last name. I scrolled back through old text. Last year, Natalie had asked, "Can I borrow your laptop?" It stayed with her a week. Did she access my password manager then? I had also sent her a PDF with my SSN from a fellowship application on the day she said her printer was broken. The puzzle began to click. Past midnight, I spotted a boutique on a statement. Fable and Ivy Natalie's obsession. I called about security footage. "We share with the proper authorities," they said. The proper authority was becoming me. I chose not to confront her. I would let her keep weaving until she was tangled in her own web. The next day, I began gathering everything I could. I placed fraud alerts with all 3 major credit bureaus: Experian, Equifax, TransUnion, and froze my accounts. I filed an identity theft report with the FTC. At the local police station, I requested an official incident record. The officer looked at me with weary eyes. "These cases have been rising lately. Do you suspect anyone close to you?" My lips trembled. "No," I said. I couldn't bring myself to say Natalie's name yet. But inside, a voice refused to quiet, because the documents contained glaring clues. On the fake account applications, the answer to the security question, "Mother's maiden name?" was the last name of an author Natalie had obsessed over back in high school. Only she and I knew that. That night, I wrote a line in my notebook. "Truth doesn't hide. It only waits for the right time." And I would wait. But my waiting was the first step in a silent war. A week later, while checking my credit report, I saw a new attempt, an auto loan application. It had been denied thanks to the freeze, but the email address used looked familiar. It was almost identical to one of Natalie's old aliases, just a single letter changed. My suspicion was no longer just a shadow. It was practically evidence, but I still needed formal documentation. That's when I decided to set a trap. I spoke with the bank, and they agreed, in collaboration with their fraud unit, to issue a flagged card. The limit would be low, but every transaction would send me real-time alerts. I also rented a P.O. box as the delivery address and installed a hidden camera. The plan was simple: let Natalie's greed weave a web that she herself would get caught in, because I knew she wouldn't stop. Greed always pulls its own noose tighter. The day came. A gray sedan pulled up in front of my P.O. box. My camera was rolling. A hooded woman stepped out, head bowed, but it was unmistakable. The same hair clip, the same gait. She grabbed the package, slipped back into the car, and drove off. My heart pounded, but I knew the trap had worked. I added the footage to my police report. The bank classified the transactions as fraud and reversed them. But I went further. I pulled the spending history from the other cards Natalie had opened and matched it with the background checks from a company she had applied to. I legally passed the evidence along to HR. Now it wasn't just me who knew her deceit, was on record in the professional world. 2. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "The heaviest price of betrayal is meeting it silently at every door you knock on." I didn't confront Natalie directly, because I knew silence strikes harder than words. But my plan was already in motion. The package footage and the bank reports were in the hands of the police. Natalie's name was now appearing in official records. A week later, a mutual friend called. Their voice was uneasy. "Claire, Natalie keeps going to job interviews, but she's being rejected everywhere." The companies tell her, "We can't proceed due to the background check." A quiet satisfaction rose inside me. It wasn't my voice speaking, it was the documents. What silenced her weren't my accusations, but her own signatures. That night, I tossed and turned in bed. Part of me hurt because once I had seen her as my sister. But another part of me knew. True justice isn't watching someone fall, it's watching them vanish into their own shadow. Months passed. Natalie seemed to have disappeared. She shut down her social media accounts and distanced herself from our circle of friends. But her silence reminded me of the sound of my own freedom. Every letter in my mailbox no longer brought fear, but control. Because I finally knew I had reclaimed my identity, my voice, myself. One day, we crossed paths at the grocery store. She fumbled with coins at the checkout, the cashier growing impatient. When our eyes met, her lips trembled. "Claire, please," she whispered. I didn't help. I just looked back with calm composure. Because I realized, true revenge isn't loud, it lies in the weight of a gaze. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "Silence is the loudest echo of betrayal." One morning, I found a thick envelope in my mailbox from the IRS. Inside was a fraudulent income statement. Natalie had tried to collect freelance payments under my identity. This wasn't just about banks and credit cards anymore, it had reached government records. I filed an updated report and the case expanded. Natalie's name was now tied directly to a federal investigation. In that moment, I realized this fight was no longer just personal. My quiet efforts had become part of a larger chain of justice. That evening, my mother hugged me. "You're not alone anymore, Claire," she said. "The system is with you." A strange peace rose inside me. Because this time, revenge wasn't just in my hands, it rested in the hands of something greater. The IRS investigation began weaving invisible chains around Natalie's life. Every job she applied to rejected her, and every bank account she tried to open was flagged instantly. One day, a mutual friend messaged me in secret. Natalie had a breakdown. She says everyone's turning their back on her. My emotions tangled. Part of me hurt because once she'd been the closest person in my life. But another part of me knew this was the result of her own choices. I had only turned on the light. She had created the shadow herself. That night, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. "You are no longer a victim," I told myself. "You are a survivor." And in my notebook, I added a new word: strength. One day, a small note appeared in my mailbox. Only 3 words were written. "Forgive me, please." It wasn't signed, but I knew whose handwriting it was. Natalie's. Holding the paper, memories of all our years together rushed through me. Our first camping trip, our late night talks, our graduation day. My chest tightened with sorrow. But then I remembered my notebook. Voice, justice, freedom, strength. Forgiveness sometimes was necessary for your own freedom. But forgiveness never meant forgetting. I placed the note in a drawer and never replied. Because I understood, some wounds heal, but their scars always remain. Months passed. Natalie's name had become a shadow in town. People didn't want to talk about her anymore, they just shook their heads. But my life had taken a completely different turn. I was promoted at my new job and I was invited to speak at a conference. In my speech, I told the young audience, protecting your identity isn't just about documents, it's about courage. I was betrayed by the closest person I knew, but my silence, my records, and my belief carried me through. The hall echoed with applause. And I realized then, Natalie's story had already faded, but mine had become a lesson, a hope for others. In my notebook, I added a new word, legacy. Natalie's silence was sometimes louder than a storm. Her absence left a void around me, but I had begun filling it with a new purpose. I volunteered at a local nonprofit, offering free guidance to victims of identity theft. My first client was a young woman. It was my closest one, too, she said, her eyes brimming with tears. I told her my story, how I patiently collected evidence, how I turned silence into a weapon. As she listened, fear faded from her face, replaced by determination. In that moment, I realized Natalie had hurt me, but she had also birthed a new strength in me, guiding others. In my notebook, I wrote a new line. The legacy of pain can become someone else's hope. One day, court documents arrived in my mailbox. Natalie's case had concluded. She was convicted of identity theft, forgery, and financial fraud. She had received a lengthy sentence. Holding the paper, I felt something strange inside. Not triumph, closure. Because I knew this outcome hadn't come from my anger, but from her own choices. I had simply made the truth visible. That evening, my mother hugged me. "You're no longer living in the past, Claire. You're writing your own future." My eyes filled with tears. Because for the first time, it wasn't shadows guiding me, it was light. After the trial ended, my life completely shifted. Universities invited me to speak, and I gave talks at conferences. People came up to me saying, "Your story gave me courage." The voice that had once been silenced was now empowering hundreds. At one conference, a young man approached me. My identity was stolen, but no one believed me. "After hearing your story, I decided to fight," he said. The light in his eyes was the return of something I thought I'd lost years ago, trust. I looked at a blank page in my notebook and wrote a new word, hope, because my story was now inspiring others to begin again. As time passed, Natalie's name vanished completely. A name I once heard everywhere in town was no longer whispered at all. People had erased her existence, but I hadn't, because every scar remains as a reminder to its bearer. One day, walking along the shore, the sound of waves brought back the past. "Why me?" still echoed inside. But then I realized maybe I had to live this story because otherwise I would never have found my voice. Natalie stole my identity, but she also gave me one, strong, resilient, undeniable. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "Sometimes thieves don't just steal, they help build who you become." One of the conferences took me to New York. I stood at the podium in a hall filled with hundreds. The lights were blinding, but my voice was steady. One day, they told me, "There's debt under your name." I thought I had lost who I was, but identity is not just in papers. Identity is the voice that refuses to be silenced. The silence in the hall broke into thunderous applause. In people's eyes, I saw reflections of their own struggles. My pain had become their compass. And I understood then, Natalie's shadow existed only in the past. My future was filled with the echoes of my own voice. On the bus ride back from New York, an elderly man sitting next to me turned and said, "I saw you on TV." I smiled. "You gave me courage," he added. In that moment, I realized my story was no longer mine alone. Even a stranger I met on the road had become part of this journey. When I got home, I opened my notebook. I flipped through the pages. Voice, justice, freedom, strength, legacy, hope. Each one was a step. On the last blank line, I placed my pen and wrote, "Unity," because I was no longer walking alone, I was building a path with others. Natalie's name began appearing in the press. Small local newspapers covered her trial, printing her photo. The life once envied was now a headline under identity theft case. When I saw the article, I paused. To everyone else, Natalie had become that girl. But to me, she remained complicated, both my childhood friend and the one who betrayed me most. That evening, I looked at my notebook. I wrote a single word, truth, because in the end, everyone had learned it. And truth sometimes is the heaviest sentence of all. One day, Natalie's mother called me. Her voice was tired and broken. "Claire, my daughter made mistakes. But she's still my child. Even if you can't forgive her, remember her in a prayer." My heart ached. Because for mothers, even their children's worst sins never outweigh their love. When I hung up, I thought for a long time. Did I want to forgive her? Maybe. But forgetting was impossible. Scars don't fade. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "Forgiveness doesn't free the past, it frees the future." As time went on, I built a new life. I rented a place in a new city, made new friends. People still asked me about my story, but now it was remembered more for strength than for pain. One evening, sitting on my balcony, I realized something. Natalie's shadow no longer hovered over me. I had drawn my own path, and that path lit the way for others who couldn't walk in silence. In my notebook, I added a new word, future, because now I wasn't defined just by the past, but by tomorrow as well. Just as I'd found my rhythm in a new city, an invitation arrived from the state legislature. They wanted me to testify at a hearing titled "Protecting Victims of Identity Theft." When I entered the chamber, legislators sat behind a long desk. Across from them were attorneys and bank representatives. The mic's red light clicked on, and my voice came out steady, clear. Identity isn't a string of numbers. It is reputation, time, and trust. When it's stolen, you don't just lose money, you lose months of your life. I presented a 3-step model: document, freeze, report. I showed the practical bridge between a credit freeze, an FTC affidavit, and a police report. Then I offered concrete fixes for victim fatigue: free counseling lines, a one-stop application portal, fair employer background guidelines. A legislator asked, "How did your silence become power?" I smiled. Silence doesn't cut off speech. It amplifies the echo. When documents speak, you can't be muted. After the session, a staffer told me, "We'll update the bill with your proposals." I realized the journey born from Natalie's shadow was turning into light for others. In my notebook, I added a new word: policy, because when a lone voice becomes a rule, it endures. A few weeks later, an email from the prosecutor's office arrived. Court-ordered restitution in Natalie's case had been approved. Small monthly payments would be deposited. Staring at the screen, I felt something odd. Not triumph, but the equation completing. My time wouldn't return, but the records finally agreed wrongdoing had a name. That same day, another letter from Natalie, postmarked from prison. The handwriting was familiar, the sentences fractured. From here, I see the size of what I did. Every die I put on you became my chain. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Just know this: I've stopped running from myself. I folded the letter and tucked it into my notebook. I didn't reply. Forgiveness isn't a petition. It requires continuity. That evening, I called the nonprofit. I decided to route every restitution dollar into a microfund for victims, filing fees, postage, counseling hours. "This money can't silence the past," I said, "but it can help someone make the first call." I realized then, when revenge yields to repair, wounds begin to close. That summer, my life settled into a rhythm. Mornings spent offering free guidance, afternoons dedicated to my own work. Nights belonged to me and my notebook. It had become my silent therapist. Every word I wrote carried away a piece of my burden. One evening by the sea, I opened the notebook. Its pages were filled, each born from the shadow Natalie had let, now carrying my own light. A young woman sitting nearby turned to me. "Are you Claire? I heard you speak at a conference." My identity was stolen too, but your story gave me strength. My eyes welled up, because I realized my notebook wasn't just guiding me, it was guiding others. I wrote a new word: guide, because once I had found my path, lighting the way for others had become my duty. In the fall, I received an offer to teach a course at a major university. The title, Identity and Trust. On the first day, as I entered the classroom, young eyes turned toward me. I wrote one sentence on the board: "Those who steal your identity try to steal your life." My lectures weren't just technical knowledge, I shared my story too. As students took notes, I saw fire and determination in their eyes. Each one was equipping themselves not to fall into the nightmare I once lived. After class, a student approached me. "Professor, someone close to me betrayed me too. Your words gave me direction." That moment I realized this wasn't just teaching, it was life itself. I added a new word to my notebook, teach, because sharing what I had learned had become part of who I was. When winter came, I discovered the quiet peace of my new home. Natalie's shadow was gone. In its place was a life filled with books, students, and volunteer work. Still, at night, she sometimes slipped into my dreams. She'd look at me and say, "Claire, I only wanted more." But when I woke, I knew she was still trapped in the past while I was walking into the future. One snowy evening, I opened my notebook by the window. I wrote a new word, peace, because at last the war inside me had ended. Revenge had turned to silence, silence to strength, and strength to peace. And that peace was the greatest victory. In the first days of the new year, an unexpected letter arrived in my mailbox. The sender, Natalie. Written from prison. "Claire," it began, "time moves differently here. Hours are heavy, mistakes heavier. I cannot deny the damage I caused you. But when I get out one day, pray silently that I may begin again." As I read, my chest tightened. Forgiveness wasn't easy. But I no longer felt hate either. It was as if I were reading an echo left in the past. I didn't respond, because I realized some stories simply close. They don't reopen. In my notebook, I wrote a new word, closure. Because my path no longer intertwined with hers, it continued with my own future. By spring, my university lectures had grown even more popular. The hall overflowed, students standing at the back. One day, a student raised their hand. "Professor, what should you do when the closest person betrays you?" My eyes drifted into the distance. "First, stay silent," I said, because silence can be the strongest reply. Then, document everything, because facts will protect you. And finally, never forget yourself, because your identity isn't only on paper, it's carried in your heart. The room fell silent, then applause broke out. And in that moment, I felt my pain had turned into armor for others. That summer, I gave an interview on national television. The host asked me, "Claire, was revenge sweet?" I smiled. "No," I said. "It wasn't sweet, but it was necessary." Because sometimes revenge isn't about the other person, it's about freeing yourself. Millions watched on their screens. My inbox flooded with messages. "Your story gave me hope." At that moment, I realized it was no longer Natalie's name echoing, it was my voice. In my notebook, I wrote in bold letters, "Freedom," because at last the chains had fallen not only from her, but from me too. After the TV interview, my life changed even more. Not only victims, but also law schools, NGOs, and even some politicians began reaching out to me. They all asked the same question: what can we learn from your experience? One evening, as I sat at home, an email appeared in my inbox. The sender, the FBI's identity theft unit. They wanted me to speak at one of their conferences. That was the moment I realized the hell Natalie had put me through had become a national lesson. I opened my notebook and wrote a new word, impact. Because my story was no longer just personal pain, it was creating a societal impact. At the FBI conference, I stood before hundreds of experts. I said, protecting an identity isn't just about technological measures. Security in human relationships matters just as much as passwords. My closest friend betrayed me. That proves firewalls sometimes fall inside our hearts. After the session, an agent approached me. "Your story reminded us not just of the crime, but of the human wound behind it," he said. At that moment, something settled in my chest, because the weight I had carried for years grew lighter when others understood it. In my notebook, I wrote, shared, because the more I shared my pain, the less it was a burden, and the more it became collective wisdom. As days went by, I received yet another message about Natalie. Through her attorney, a note was passed to me. She wants to participate in community service. Your recommendation will be considered. Reading it made my heart tighten. Part of me wanted her to give back to others. Another part feared it was only a formality. I thought long and hard. Finally, I sent a single sentence back to the lawyer. True service isn't written in records. It's written in hearts. I added nothing else, because I knew change doesn't happen on paper. Real change is born in silence and in choices. In my notebook, I wrote, choice, because every person's future is nothing more than the echo of their own decisions. By spring, the rhythm of my life had fully settled. Between my lectures, conferences, and volunteer work, the distance between me and the past grew wider. Natalie's name existed only in old documents and yellowed newspaper clippings. One day, a student asked me, "Professor, do you still keep that notebook?" I smiled and pulled it from my desk. I showed the pages: voice, justice, freedom, strength, legacy, hope, impact, choice. "This isn't just a notebook," I said. "It's my second identity, because every word traces my rebirth." That night, I added a new word, growth, because my life was no longer nourished by Natalie's shadow, but by my own growth. At a panel I was invited to in early summer, someone asked me, "Claire, what was the most powerful moment of your revenge story?" The room went silent. I took a deep breath and said, "The most powerful moment wasn't the day I watched Natalie fall. It was the day I stopped living in her shadow." Applause followed, but the echo inside me was louder. Because as I said those words, I truly felt the rope of the past slip from my hands. That day, I wrote a new word in my notebook, release. Because breaking chains isn't just about freeing your enemy, it's about freeing yourself. As the years passed, Natalie's name was forgotten. A line in prison records, a footnote in old newspapers, that was all. But my story grew, branched out, and touched the lives of others. One day, I sat by the sea again. Between the sound of waves, I opened my notebook. I flipped through the pages and realized the notebook was nearly full. On the last blank page, I wrote, eternal, because my story was no longer confined to one person's betrayal. It had become a lesson, a hope that would echo forever. I closed my eyes and whispered, "She stole my identity," but I took my life back. One day, an old newspaper clipping appeared in my mailbox. Headline: New regulations and identity theft cases. Beneath it, a small note read, "Because of you." I didn't know who left it, but I smiled. Because a journey that began with one person's betrayal had now reached as far as the law. That night, I wrote in my notebook, ripple, because a single stone cast into water can ripple all the way to the farthest shore. Natalie's name was no longer spoken in my life, but sometimes she appeared in my dreams. She would look at me and say, "You should have fallen with me." I woke up smiling, because I knew I hadn't fallen. I had risen. In my notebook, I wrote a new word, rise, because true revenge isn't hidden in the fall, it's in the rise. Years later, I was invited to contribute to a major book project, From Identity to Identity, Stories of the Silent War. I wrote my story, turning each word from my notebook into a chapter. When the book was published, people wrote to me, "Your story changed my life." I closed my notebook. Its pages were full now, but my story lived on in new pages in the pens of others. One day, a student asked me, "Professor, do you still carry your notebook?" I pulled it from my bag and showed the last page. "It's full now," I said, "but your notebook is empty. You'll be the one to fill it." The hope in their eyes gave me all the answers I needed. Because this was the greatest transformation of revenge, when my story became someone else's beginning. I sat by the sea one last time. The waves accompanied me as I closed my notebook. The journey that had begun years ago in Natalie's shadow now ended in my own light. I closed my eyes and whispered, "My best friend stole my identity, but I took my life back." And this time, revenge wasn't silence. It was freedom that would last forever.